Welcome to the Podcast Editing and Support Show. My name is Dave. Are you ready? Are you ready? Let's go. We're going to start the episode right now. Happy to have you here. Let's do this. Welcome back to the podcast. Glad to have you back. So, one of the tools I think that all of us need as podcast editors and support people is a podcast planner, kind of like a guide that we can use when we sit down with our podcasters and start working with them as clients. So, to have nothing like a blank piece of paper and try to figure out how you can best serve your clients is not the best and most efficient way to start. So creating a planner might be one of the things that would be a great resource for you. So what I'm going to do over the next few episodes is actually outline and help you craft your own planner. I will share my own planner with you, and you can get that anytime through my website and reaching out to me. I'd love to send it to you. It's a working copy. It changes over time. So you might be listening to this, when this podcast comes out, you might be listening to it a year from now. And that's a working document. It's going to change and adjust over time as the industry changes and as products and services change. But at least it's a template. It's a guide. It's a starting point. And you can use it, cut it up, change it up, do whatever you want with it. But you're not starting with a blank piece of paper when you sit down with your podcast host. So let's go over a few things over the next few episodes, and we're going to be focusing on podcast planners for you as a podcast editing and support person. Excited? You ready? Okay. Go grab a pen, a coffee, a blank piece of paper, maybe. Make some notes. Throw it in your phone, whatever you want to do. Let's jump in and start planning out our planners. That's fun to say here on the Podcast Editing and Support Show. Thanks for listening. So if you fail to plan, you plan to fail, right? That's kind of the saying, something like that. So I think we as editors and support people need to have a plan. So many people in creative spaces love the creative side of doing things, but maybe aren't the most organized, maybe aren't the most disciplined people. We like to create new things. We like to create messes and create all these different things and have all these different spinning things going on around us. But the idea of being a planned out, organized person, probably not some of our strong suits as creatives, because who's got time for that, right? We don't got time for that. So we want to move forward and just create new things all the time. And that's why people like me have 8 podcasts, because we just want to keep creating new all the time. We love the creation process. It's the day-to-day maintenance that seems to be quite hard to do on a consistent basis. So any kind of tools or resources we can get that can help steer us in that direction, I think is a good thing. So the first part of this little mini-series we're going to go through around creating a planner for your podcast is something you can create and then give to your podcast host. We're going to start today, we're going to looking at all the aspects around the planning part. We're going to talk about the concept of the podcast and the details of the podcast title, the episode title and number, publish dates, episode duration, and guest information. Those are some of the things we're going to talk about in today's episode as part of our drafting of our podcast planner. It's going to be right at the top of the page. Some of the most important information you're going to need at the very beginning of creating a podcast or creating a discussion around serving your podcast host. Planning, concept and details, the title of the show, the episode titles and numbers, publish dates, episode duration, and guest information. Lots to cover. Again, all the information in the show notes, and you'll be able to download my copy of my planner. That'll be available through my podcasteditingandssupport.com website. Reach out to me anytime. I'd love to help you with this. So let's jump in. We're going to start with the planning side of all this. Again, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. So let's not fail with our podcast and our support. Let's start with the planning part, right off the top. As a podcast editor or virtual assistant, support person in podcasting, your role in episode planning is crucial to the success of your client's podcasts. Again, we're getting beyond the ums and ahs and just doing the simple audio edits. We can do so much more, and we can help with the planning side of actually what goes out for the podcast host. Remember, podcast hosts are busy. They got lives. They got things going on. They have businesses to run. People report to them. They're busy doing all this other thing. A podcast, in some situations, is kind of an add-on to already a long list of to-dos. So anything you can do to offer support and beyond the editing, again, that's why we call the show the podcast editing and support show. We want to get beyond just the editing side because that's just one small component of what we offer. The planning side is the one side that I think a lot of podcasters and new podcasters as hosts, they need the most help with because they run out of ideas quickly, where you and I, as editors and support people, we see the industry, we see what's going on around us, and we can be a great voice to help them in the planning stages ongoing for their show. By mastering the art of podcast planning, we can help our clients to be more consistent, more engaged with their content, with their audiences, and create content that really resonates with their audience so that the audience keeps coming back to episode. So I have a comprehensive guide here to help you to better serve your podcast host clients. First, we're going to talk about the concept and details around the podcast. Let's jump in. The foundation of any great podcast episode lies in its concept and details. Your job is to help your clients refine their ideas and organize them in an effective manner that serves them and encourages them to create content. So one thing you can do as a podcast editor and support person is to host brainstorming sessions with your podcaster to help them to identify maybe a calendar and some releases and some themes. You can really start steering and directing them in that direction. Schedule a brainstorming session with your client early on in the process to discuss potential topics for upcoming episodes, identify any themes. These can be calendar themes. So here in Canada, we have Thanksgiving in October. Our U.S. friends have Thanksgiving in November. So maybe there's an episode around thankfulness or gratefulness or gratitude. That could be gratitude to the listeners, gratitude towards past guests. Those are episodes, right, where you can bring back things and all that. You can also then create when you know that your host is going on summer vacation with the family and they're not going to be around. So maybe you're planning out in January for the summer vacation that's going to happen that year. All of that. Brainstorming sessions are great. You can really help steer the host towards success by just kind of planning out what's going to happen. Identify those themes and also explore any current trends or issues that's in your podcast area and what you talk about. So brainstorm with your host. Again, this goes beyond the ums and ahs in audio editing. You can do that all day, but that's so limited as far as the service levels you can provide to your host. Get in there and brainstorm with your host. The other thing is to work around their content calendar. Again, I'm telling you that as creatives, we don't like structure. We don't like due dates and calendars and meetings and deadlines. We like creative stuff. We just like creating things. And most of the things we create are half done. We're trying to be more disciplined. We're trying to be more organized. And remember, for some of us, we're working with businesses that have a podcast. They run on calendars. They run on due dates and expectations and ROI and all of these things. They expect to meet a goal. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in business. And you want to work with them, you're going to have to start leaning into your organizational side. And if that's not your go-to place where you feel most comfortable, then you need to become more comfortable. And a content calendar is going to help. And you can help direct your host with this. Create and maintain a content calendar that outlines episode titles for maybe the next 3 to 6 months. So that way, if it's 3 to 6 months, well, if it's 6 months, twice a year, you're going to have a conversation. But also kind of look at any special episodes. We talked about holiday themed, maybe milestone episodes where they reach episode 10 or episode 50, episode 100. And then also guest appearance scheduling, like how often are we going to have a guest on the show? What does that look like? How long are these episodes going to be with that guest? Who's finding the guest? Are you going to help as the support person to the host of the show? All those things come out as you plan out your calendar. So either you do a big paper calendar, like the old school days, like we used to do, or online calendar that you share between host and editor, but have something that kind of gives us some idea of what's coming. And as an editor, that's a beautiful thing that we offer, is because the host now has somebody to be accountable to record the episode and get it out on time. you become one of their biggest support people in that they feel obligated to meet a deadline because you're waiting to do the edits and support them. So you can be what keeps people podcasting just by being an editor and supporting them in their podcast journey. So you can help more people succeed with their podcast just by you being there, waiting to help them and to work with them. Grab a content calendar, figure out what's going to work, and plan out what works best for your host. But I would say 3 months to 6 months is a good time frame to keep in mind as you're planning out your calendar into the future. It's going to help you as well to know consistent work is coming your way that you can then plan for, budget around, fill your calendar with other clients because you know when and where you need to be to help your podcast hosts. And that's a great way to build your business. You need consistent work to do this as more than just a hobby, as a podcast editor and support person. The next part, it's all around the titling of the podcast. So when you look at my podcast planner, you're going to notice that this information's all near the top of the page. Why is that? Because it's probably the most important stuff that you need to know as the bare bones of the podcast to get going and get started. And the podcast title is something that really is important, not just because we need to know the name of the show, but there's something very important about how the podcast title works out in the world, online, on websites, on social media, on search engines. That title is super important. And you need to have something that reflects how people would find it. That's the biggest thing. I always say when I meet with people and they give me some vague podcast titles that require explanation or interesting spelling or the number 2 instead of the word TO. There's a lot of different things that happen in podcast titling where people are trying to be super cute, which is great. Super cute's fine, but super cute won't be found as easily as something that's predictable, easy to remember, and searchable. Something that people are actually looking for online. So when you look at your podcast title, it's typically established usually by your podcast host, but you can help your client ensure consistency across all the platforms. The other thing I like to do when somebody comes to me with a title for their show, and maybe they already have episodes in the world, they've got artwork, they've already been down that path. If the title of the show is not super specific, then adding, just like a book would have a subtitle, so it'll be the name of the book, colon, and then a continuation of the idea of what the book is about. You can also do that in podcasting world. So the name of the show, the blah blah show, and people aren't looking for the blah blah show anywhere particularly, but it's the blah blah show, and it's the how to renovate an old house. It could be the blah blah show, financial independence for university students. There you go. So the blah blah show makes sense now because of the extension. It's always a good way to give your podcast a little more search juice than just the blah blah show, for example. Nobody knows what that is. Adding that little extension just gives you a little bit more ways to be found. So work with your hosts on the title of the show. Verify that the title is correctly displayed on all the podcast directories if they're coming to you with this podcast, and then suggest any minor adjustments if needed, like adding subtitles for clarity. We talked about this. Also, just working with them to make sure that there's consistency from podcast to podcast, and wherever they are, on a website, on the name of the show that's on all the players, there's a consistent podcast title that's clear and something that people are looking for. That's really, really important. The next thing is all around podcast titles and the numbers for the show. The podcast itself needs to have a great name for the podcast, but don't neglect the podcast titles for the episodes themselves. Crafting a compelling episode title that is attracting to listeners is one of the best ways for people as they scroll through the myriad of all the different podcasts out there. You want to give it the best chance possible to be played. And that's going to require something more than just copying the name of the podcast and putting it as the episode title. We don't need to do that because the podcast already shows and displays the name of the podcast. So we really don't need it in the episode title specifically. You need to have some information in there that makes people kind of wonder if this is the right episode for them. So work with your client on creating catchy, descriptive titles that don't overpromise and underdeliver. Make sure that your titles are optimized for search results, including relevant keywords. Easy to do. Just go to Google and start typing in things in and around the name of the show. And then Google will autofill and give you other suggestions of things that people are actually looking for that your podcasting can answer. And then maintain consistent numbering systems, whether you do it in the actual episodes that go out into the world or just in your files naming system to keep your files consistent. So for me, I always use episode. I use the letter E for episode, and then I have a 3-digit number because most podcasts are going to be between 0 to 999 episodes. And so a 3-digit number works for me. So it'll be E001 is episode 1, and then the title of the episode. I do that so that when I'm looking at and sorting through my files on my computer, I can quickly search and sort by the name or sort by the date or all that other stuff. It just helps me to have a consistent numbering system for my files. I also like to put it into some of my shows, especially if I'm referring back to former episodes on a frequent basis, for the listener to send them back to just the title of the episode back in your catalog of past episodes. Some of my podcasts have more than 500 episodes. It's very hard to find it. So having an episode number does help narrow down the search. It makes it easier for my listener. Not everybody's going to agree with that as a common practice or a suggested practice for your podcast. But for me, I see benefits to the listener, so I do that for them. So that's how I work with that. So there are some kind of interesting title formula examples that you can include when you're drafting potential titles for your podcast episodes. I would say there's 3. There's question-based episode titles. So one of my podcasts is called the How to Podcast series. So it's kind of like right in there, right? Because people are actually typing that, which helps people find my show. But having a question-based episode title is also really beneficial. So how to, and then in brackets, you want to achieve a result, how to do something and then a time frame. So how to build a fence in 1 day. Okay, well, there you go. That's I only have a day, and I'm trying to build a fence. So I'm going to go to Google. I'm going to type in, how do I build a fence in 1 day? And guess what comes up? Your show. That's the best way to be found, is to actually formulate your episode titles in the form of a question. Just think Jeopardy all the time, and you'll be fine. The other part you can do as a second option is to do more of a list-based episode title example, and that would be something like 5 essential tips for building a fence. Okay, so then there'll be a list of 5 things. It's kind of what I'm doing here. I'm kind of listing out things for you in a way that you can kind of follow along, but give them a list and have it as a complete list that covers all the main things in one spot. Really easy. The last one as an example of a title formula could be something intriguing as a statement. So like the surprising truth about building a fence. What could that be? I don't know. I have no idea. That could be all kinds of different things. But you kind of leave it open-ended. It's kind of like when my kids were little and they were goofing around in the car. And you would just say, like, if you told them, if you don't stop, you're not going to get a snack before you go to bed tonight. So now they can do the math and go, is the fooling around worth it? Do I really need the snack? But if you leave it more open-ended, like, if you don't stop, you're not going to be happy when you get home. Okay, now I don't know what that means. So now I'm curious, and I'm going to probably stop acting up in the car. It's a nice little trick. So use that in the name of your titles to create mystery and curiosity, which could cause people to actually press play on the episode. So that's another way to use your titles in a good way. Also, talk to your podcast host around the published date for the podcast itself. One of the things that you're going to hear talked about a lot in podcasting, if you listen to any podcasts about podcasting, is the term consistency. Now, consistency is important because it does create habits, and habits are hard to break, and people will then put you into their world and build their world around the constant releases of a podcast, whether that's weekly, daily, monthly, yearly, I don't know, whatever your consistency is. But showing up for your audience in a predictable fashion does create habits. So establish a regular publishing schedule with your podcast host so that there's an agreement that the podcast will go out Tuesday morning at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Now, that's important for several reasons. One of them, which is just that the host then needs to get you the files in time for you to meet that deadline, which you've agreed on. So there's there's a selfish reason for that. And so make sure that you put that out there. What is the due date for the file to be live on the players? When are we releasing the episode? And that becomes a calendar to-do report and a deadline that is in there for everyone to see. So if you have a 6 a.m. Tuesday Eastern Standard Time release date and they don't get you the episode content to edit until Monday at midnight, then you're not going to meet your deadline. And that's not your fault as an editor. That the onus goes back on the host. So you're going to reverse engineer to meet a Tuesday 6 a.m. deadline. I need to have the file to me by this date so I have enough time to actually do the edits, do all the work, and get the episodes live to meet your deadline. So make sure that you have an established published date and time. Don't forget about time zones. Make sure you have that established when you sit down. And that's why this is at the top of the list as part of the podcast planning sheet that I have for you, is you want to make sure that there's clear understanding so we can all meet our deadlines. The other thing is to create a publishing calendar, as we talked about, with a buffer for unexpected delays, holidays, sickness, people away from the office, people not responding to emails. You need some kind of buffer in there as well. Don't be too short with your timelines. As well, you're working for other clients, so you got to work everything around that as well. And then set up any automated publishing you can do in your hosting platform if they allow it. If you can have a Tuesday morning release time in place, I would say have everything ready on Monday and then loaded Monday for a Tuesday morning release so that you're not trying to do it all on the day of the release. So you give yourself a buffer. That's your job to make sure that you have that space. The next part is all around the duration of the episodes. Aim for some consistency in the episode length so that it meets kind of the expectation of the listener. If you have one episode on week 1 that is 5 minutes, and then week 2 it's 3 hours, and week 3 it's 35 minutes, right? You're all over the place. And when we talk about creating habits, people will then put you into their buckets of time in their week where they'll listen to you during a certain thing. So if my dog walk is 10 minutes, I'm looking for a 10-minute podcast or a 20-minute podcast over 2 days or 30 over 3 days, the type of thing. They try to build you into their world. So you want to be able to create in a more consistent way. You're not tied to this. You don't have to hit the number on the nose every episode, but you want to have something that's kind of consistent. So you're a 20-minute to 30-minute podcast. You're a 60-minute to 45-minute podcast, and you kind of sit in that area. You don't have extreme highs and extreme lows without it being a special. And then you communicate that so people know that this is a special episode. So you're not tied to it. You're not bound to this, but you do want to create something that feels like it's consistent, like you know what you're doing. So analyze successful podcasts in your client's area and give suggestions about what you think a good episode length might be. Your host might have no idea. Suggest a target range, maybe 30 to 40 minutes, and develop strategies to maintain consistent length. Example, better editing, segment timing, or in the podcast planning. Just what do we want to cover? If it's an interview, it's solo hosted, so you have an idea of where you're going with this. Episode duration is important, and that's why it's up at the top of the list, and good to talk about with your host right at the beginning of your planning stages. The next part's all around guest information. This is only if you have guests on the podcast. You don't have to have guests on your show. It's not a requirement. It might be popular, and it might be a lot of shows doing this, and you're like, well, If everybody's doing it, I must do it. It's not really that way at all. You can do a solo episodes. You can do co-hosted episodes. It's completely up to you. But if you are going to do a guest-focused podcast, for interview-based podcasts, you really need to thoroughly give preparation for your guests in that you're going to do guest research. You're going to conduct in-depth research on potential guests. I would include going around and listening to them on other shows if they are, all their media, all their background information, social media, website, where do they show up and how do they like to show up? That's something that you can do research for your host on their behalf to save them time. And then prepare a basic background about the guest and pull in their bio, all that information, and have that ready for the host. So they don't have to do that. And then maybe you have a conversation. So today we got Tammy on the show. Tammy is a business person who started her own business after her kids moved out of the house as they grew up. She's an empty nester and she loves chocolate, and her favorite movie on Netflix is Wicked. I don't know, something, right? So you have some information for your host about the guest. That's really going to help them as well. The other part you can do as far as helping your host around guesting is helping them with their outreach and their scheduling. So whether you work with somebody great like Podmatch, which can just like a dating service for podcasters and guests. I use it. It's great. You can use services like that to assist you in the process of finding people, but you need to do some outreach and create an email that you can use as a kind of a starting point to reach out to these people. But please don't send out generic, meaningless, nameless emails. Make sure that you're tailoring it because you did the research, right, on the guest. You're going to know how to talk to them as the way they like to be spoken to and how they show up. So do that in the emails. But you can create an email outreach campaign on behalf of the host to be that person to support them and start making those connections. You can also manage the scheduling process, include the follow-ups, reminders, any of that information, tech stuff, questions around microphones and recording dates and platforms that you're going to record on. Definitely help in that. That'd be very helpful for your host. And then the pre-interview preparation. You could send the guests a pre-interview questionnaire to gather more talking points or things they want to talk about on the show, and prepare a briefing document for your client, for your host, with potential questions that you've found and discussion topics based on your research. It's really helpful for your host. Again, remember, your host is busy. They're doing other things besides podcasting. They've hired you to help them. So beyond the ums and ahs, we're here to help them and support them as a podcaster. So helping them do this in the background, I think you're going to show up that you're going to be a great resource for your podcaster. So that's your starting point for your podcast planner, our little mini series we're going to do. A couple more episodes coming up. We're going to kind of fill in kind of more detail for you. And as well, like I mentioned, if you want a copy of my podcast planner, reach out to me through my podcasteditingandsupport.com website. Links in the show notes. You know how we do things. And I'd love to send you a copy, just a PDF copy. Doesn't cost anything to send that off to you. It's my gift to you for listening to the show. Would love to send that off. So join me back here for some more episodes again around this podcast planner. And if I can help you in any way, would love to have you here with us. One thing we don't talk about often here, and I haven't mentioned it very much, is we do have a meetup group for podcasters and podcast editors and anyone that has anything to do with podcasting. We host it on meetup.com. And if you're interested, I can send you a link as well. So come and join us. We have conversations every Saturday morning. And we've also added some Tuesday ones as well. And we'd love to have you. Again, it's free. Just get together with other podcasters, ask questions, get suggestions, meet people in the podcasting space. You're always welcome to join us. And you can find that information in the show notes as well. So thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of the podcast editing and support community. Get out there, find your next podcast to work on, and find your next editor. Thanks for listening to the Podcast Editing and Support Show. Visit us at podcasteditingandsupport.com, podcasteditingandsupport.com. We would love to help you find a great podcast editor, or if you want to hire us, we would love to work with you. Podcasteditingandsupport.com. Catch you on the next episode. Take care.